This says chapter 2 up here, but it's actually chapter 3. It's our second module, however. And we're going to be talking about biological bases of behavior. And I always preface this by acknowledging that for many of you, you signed up for psychology imagining one thing, and then spend the first chapter we go through talking about research, and then the second chapter talking about biology. And I imagine there's more than a few of you who are thinking, this is not what I expected. This is a science class. And there's a couple of answers to that. The first is yes, this is a basic science of psychology class. But the second answer is that these three chapters are very important in understanding the rest of what we'll talk about. And I promise you that in the next module, we talk about consciousness, we talk about dreams and substances and all kinds of things that fit more closely, I imagine, what you thought you'd be talking about in this course. But the other thing is that I know that there's probably a lot of you that are dreading talking about biology. Maybe you read the book chapter and are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And I always make two promises to make a promise to my students about this. The first is that I promise I will work very hard and typically successfully at making the biology feel much more accessible to you in these lectures and in our discussions than it did perhaps when you were reading the textbook. But the other thing is that every semester I have converts. I have people who thought they were going to hate biology who are fascinated by it by the time we finish talking about it. So I guess I encourage you to come at this both with an open mind and to allow your levels of anxiety, if you have that, to come down a little bit, so that you can approach this and be reassured that I won't leave you hanging, and that we'll do this together. So the first thing, biological psychology is really about how if psychology is a study of human behavior and mental process, biological psychology or biopsychology is really the study of how biological processes inform and direct our behavior and mental process. And we're going to move here. So, we're going to start with the smallest element. So we're going to talk first about cells and cell communication. And then we're going to work up to talking about the brain and the nervous system. And so, I want to start, though, by inviting you to think about the idea that nothing happens. So hopefully you've already read the textbook chapter and you know what I mean by a neuron and neuron communication. But that nothing happens in your life, not a thing, without neurons firing. So as you read these slides and you're breathing and you're thinking and maybe you're tapping your hand or listening to music in the background or whatever you're doing, neurons are firing in order for any of that stuff to happen. And there is chemical messages being sent and there is electrical communication being sent in order to make any of that happen. If we were together in a room, I would at this point throw a tennis ball to one of you. If I was, wanted to be less generous, I could throw it at somebody. But I would toss a tennis ball to somebody and ask the rest of the class to count to see how long it took from the time the ball left my hand until it reached the other person. And typically it's about 1.5 seconds that happens. I'm sorry, I just got distracted by a giant heron flying in my pond. Right, so I throw the tennis ball, and it takes a second or two to get there. And I want you to think about what has to happen in that second or two that the tennis ball leaves my hand and is caught by somebody else. Because the light, from the tennis ball, if you understand how eyes work, light reflects off the tennis ball and enters our pupil. Our pupil is simply a hole in our eye that allows light in. And that light hits the retina at the back of the eye. The retina has light-sensitive receptors on it. In fact, the retina is a translator. We'll talk about this in a later chapter more, so that it can respond to light on one side of it, and on the other side of it, it sends out chemical messages to neurons. And so the light reflects off the tennis ball into the pupil, hits the retina, and from there, neurons send the messages back to the occipital lobe, right? So hopefully you remember from your reading The occipital lobe, our visual cortex, is at the back of our head. And so neuron, 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 back to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe recognizes the image and then sends that information, neuron, 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 right, up to our frontal lobe that has to make a decision. And the frontal lobe decides it has to catch that ball, right? Now the frontal lobe needs to send a message to the somatosensory cortex that controls our body. And again, using neurons, and the somatosensory cortex then sends messages down our spine and out to our arms to move muscle to catch the ball. All of that is happening in under 2 seconds, and that is an amazing thing. And at the same time, even while that's happening, you're breathing, you're thinking, oh my God, why did she throw the ball to me? You're wondering what this has to do with psychology, you're whatever else, you're just digesting your breakfast. All of it is happening because neurons are sending messages. And the idea that we can send a message from our brain to our big toe, right, the greatest distance we have to cover, in a 50th of a second is really very amazing. And so let's back up here a little bit and talk about what a neuron is. And a neuron is a cell in our nervous system. Its one job is to send a message when it gets a message. I think it's one way of thinking about neurons is that they function like dominoes. Neurons don't decide whether they're sending a message. Neurons don't send strong or weak messages. Neurons have no idea why they're sending a message. They have no idea what the end result is going to be. But if one neuron, right, like dominoes, if this neuron gets a message, it sends a message to the next one, and then so on and so forth. I gave you, right, that neuron diagram on the, whoops, I'm sorry guys, on the previous slide. Here, there's also diagrams in your textbook, and we'll look at more close-up diagrams as we go along here. You're going to need to memorize the parts that are labeled in these diagrams. I promise you there will be an exam question where you have to label a neuron with its parts. So make sure that you do that. Make sure you ask questions if you're not sure about something. If you look at photographs of neurons in terms of microphotography, they look kind of web-like. They don't run in any particular direction. They go wherever they're needed, but we are always going to look at neurons in this very linear way because it just makes it easier for us to talk about them. We're going to talk about them as if they have a top and a bottom, or a left and a right, and we're always going to talk about communication as if it goes from the left to the right. As in the same way that we read, so that the top or the left part is going to be the receiving end as we talk about it, and the bottom or the right part is going to be the sending end in terms of messages. As we talk about neurons, there's 2 types of neurons, motor neurons and sensory neurons. Motor neurons move muscle. And essentially they make things happen in your body. So motor neurons always go from the brain to the body. Sensory neurons tell the brain what's happening in the body, and so they always go from the body to the brain. And that's, it's important to know that happens. But as we talk about communication, it's the same regardless of the type of neuron. So that is not going to be any different. Just did that. And so let's talk a little bit more about neuron anatomy. And again, this is just a memorization process, but if you understand better what the different parts do, it will be easier to memorize it. So the first part, if we do this kind of left, right, top down, is our dendrites. And the dendrites would be are up here. They come off the cell body that we'll talk about in a second. But it's this, the boxed image down here that I want you to look at, because at the very bottom is the dendrite and then the receptor sites that are on the dendrite. And you can see here them receiving neurotransmitter molecule. One analogy I like to use that sometimes is useful is to think about neurons like trees. It's not a perfect analogy, but if you think about a tree, and think of the dendrites as the branches, and remember that trees have many branches. And similarly, neurons have many dendrites. And then at the ends of the dendrites are receptor sites in the same way that at the ends of branches there are leaves. That is one way of thinking about it. And these receptor sites are cup-like structures. They're at the end of the dendrites. You can see them here in the box diagram. This is where the message is actually received. And so they're cup-like. They have unique structures that allow specific neurotransmitter molecules to fit into them. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But that is the receiving end and where communication starts. And it's specifically, that is where the chemical communication is taking place. This is a blow-up that you see in front of you of a cell body or a soma. Either term is okay. Soma just means body in Greek. And we're not going to talk much about this going forward because it really the parts that you're seeing in front of you really are the same parts that any other cell has in terms of its life-sustaining function. And there's not a lot about the cell body that is unique and important to communication, but it is that kind of round area in the middle of the neuron and has the nucleus for the cell. And then here's more blow up, so that this is the other end of the neuron, and this is the axon that comes off the soma or the cell body. Every neuron has one axon, just like in our analogy, every tree has one trunk. And that is another way of remembering that. And then, like a tree, it has these kind of root-like structures, which are terminal branches, unfortunately, in terms of my analogy, but they're terminal branches and come off of that axon. And we can see here that there is something called myelin that goes around the axon of some neurons, and most commonly around the axons of motor neurons. And as we talk about how communication happens, we'll flesh this out a little bit more. But briefly, myelin is a fatty substance that speeds up how quickly the message can go from one end of the neuron to the other. All right, so here we are at the very end of the neuron. At the end of the axon, there are axon terminals and axon terminal buttons, which are sacs, and you can see kind of that shape there, and you can see those little blue circles are molecules of neurotransmitter that are getting released into the synapse, which is that fluid-filled space between neurons. And so when we're at the sending end, the terminal knob or the terminal button, either term is fine, releases those molecules into the synapse, and that is kind of the end of the story for a single chemical part of the communication for a neuron. They receive things at the beginning of, back at the dendrite, to receive neurotransmitter, and then when all is said and done, they release neurotransmitter back out through the terminal knob or button. Not the same neurotransmitter molecules, those are different molecules. The molecules don't travel through the neuron, and that's an important thing to remember. So we're going to pause here and then come back on another video to talk about how this communication happens.